Okay, we are on to our next connective tissue, which is blood. So blood is a connective tissue, or a type of connective tissue. And so far we've been talking about connective tissue proper, which included dense and loose varieties of connective tissue proper. An example of a loose variety of connective tissue proper would have been adipose tissue, or loose areolar connective tissue. And an example of dense connective tissue proper included both dense regular and dense irregular connective tissue. Then we spent a few moments looking at cartilage, specifically hyaline cartilage. We have other types of cartilage like elastic cartilage and fibrocartilage, but we really won't spend any time emphasizing them in this class. Now, another variety of connective tissue is blood. And you'll probably remember that when we first started describing connective tissues, we didn't really describe it by its cells. We really categorized connective tissue by its extracellular matrix, or the stuff outside of the cells. And so when we look at blood, we find that blood includes cells that are in a fluid matrix, which we call the plasma. The liquid component of the blood we call plasma. So blood, we have cells. Sometimes we'll call these cells, some of these cells anyway, we'll call them formed elements. We have cells in a fluid matrix. Now, what types of cells do we have? We have red blood cells, or RBCs. These are also called erythrocytes. We have white blood cells. These are called leukocytes. And then we have platelets. And these are called thrombocytes. And altogether, we call these formed elements. Now, just to be clear, the white blood cells, these are the only formed elements that are actually complete whole cells with all of the regular stuff that we will describe in a couple of weeks as being part of a cell. They have a nucleus, they have a cell membrane, they have all of the regular organelles that we would associate with cells, like the Golgi apparatus and mitochondria. Red blood cells, they have most of the normal cellular components, and they're round, and they really look like cells, although they are lacking many organelles. And then platelets are just fragments. They're fragmented cells. They all come from a similar source or origin, and we will talk about that more when we talk about blood and the cardiovascular system. Let's take a look at blood, and we'll look for some of these cell types or formed elements in our sample of blood. So here we are. We are back at the University of Michigan's virtual Slidebox website. And let's do some clicking. We'll zoom in on this sample of blood. And let's see what we can find. I'm going to zoom right around this area here because I can see a few different things. I can see some cell fragments, or thrombocytes, platelets. I can see that we find lots and lots of these pinkish staining cells. These cells right here and right here and right here, all over our picture here, these are all red blood cells. And red blood cells, we'll describe them in a second, but they have this what's called a biconcave shape. So you can see that the outside of the cell stains rather darkly, and then in the center, you see how it's starting to form a little bit of a white spot there? That's where the stain, or the cell is a little bit more, I would say, translucent, and we're kind of looking through the cell because there's not as much stuff there. It's got this it looks like a jelly donut, kind of with the jelly missing, so it's a biconcave disc, and I want to draw you a picture of that in a minute. But all of these are all red blood cells, or erythrocytes. And then we have a couple of examples of leukocytes here. These larger cells, like right here and right here, those are white blood cells. Now, in advanced anatomy and physiology, you'll learn that this right here is a good example of a segmented neutrophil, and this is a good example of a lymphocyte right here. But for our class and for our purposes today, if you just know them as white blood cells, also called leukocytes, you'll be just fine. And same here. If you know these as red blood cells, that is fantastic. They're also called erythrocytes. You need to know both of those terms. And then we see a few cellular fragments here. Those would be platelets, also called thrombocytes. Let me spend a minute and describe to you the shape of that red blood cell. Let me draw it for you. So we're going to look at just a red blood cell. And I'm going to stand it on, like if we looked at a cell kind of as if it was like a nickel and we stood it on end, it would look something like this. It's kind of wide around the margin and narrow toward the center. And so it's concave on one side and concave on the other side. And so that's why we call this a biconcave disc. Now, if we looked at this and we were looking at it like we're taking that cell and we're just putting it flat on a surface, the outside is the thicker part, right? And that takes up stain more readily, and that's why it's a little darker around the outside. And then the inside takes up stain a little bit more sparsely. There's just not as much stuff there. So it looks rather dark on the outside and less dark toward the center, and that's what we see under the microscope. So that's an example of a red blood cell. And we'll talk more about them as we progress through this class.